Right, today we're looking at women in art in the 1950s and 1960s, as well as in pop art. So, the topics that we're going to be looking at here is kind of the background with the ideal suburban housewife and 1950s, 1960s advertisements and how women are portrayed in imagery in the advertisements, as well as on media through television. And then in pop art, we're going to be looking at the difference between general pop art and women in pop art, and then the following specific artist. To provide a little bit of background and historical context to the artwork and imagery that we're going to be looking at, um, the ideal suburban housewife image that then got portrayed and made into imagery and advertisements in the media, and was reinforced with this suburban housewife, really emerged from the end of World War II and the emerging Cold War anxieties. So it had a combination of those things. One of the things, of course, is that the end of the war did lead to an economic growth because we were kind of a lender nation during that war. And this led to a huge focus on consumption. The other thing was that you had the GI Bill, which uh, allowed for education for those soldiers. Of course, it was largely targeted towards white soldiers, and while everyone else was largely excluded. This meant that a lot of the prosperity and economic growth after the war was towards the white middle class. And they're the ones that end up moving to the suburbs because of this increased prosperity, because of increase in job opportunities, and of course, because the suburbs started to be built around this time, leading to the middle classes moving out of the city. All right, with the move to the suburbs, you also had, in combination with this, Cold War anxieties, because this got attached with the end of the war to the not only the fear of communism and the atomic bombs, but the idea of that it was the responsibility of the United States to fight against communism. And while there certainly was, legitimate concern about the tensions and increase in Cold War tensions that could lead to nuclear war, it also was reinforced or exaggerated in some because communism became something that was simply inherently evil and antithetical to capitalism, and so that was bad, and that everything that could be done to combat that should be done. This also created this kind of culture of fear. They did drills in schools, where like they have the kids hide under the desks, which wouldn't do anything, but I guess it made people feel better than doing nothing. But they also it created a whole cultural structure around it with products made around that fear of nuclear attacks, that which included bomb shelters being built in people's homes. And here you can see these are just some of the products that were made that were connected to the nuclear bombs and weaponry and that type of thing. They had a board game that they created. There was your own nuclear kit you could buy. So there was tons of course, to go with the theme of consumption in the 1950s was that they took the fear of nuclear war and made it into a bunch of products to sell people. Um, and but this did connect to this idea that not only an emphasis on American values to combat communism, but that consumerism, consumption, um, right? That buying stuff, right? Your money and is that could fight against communism, right? The opposite of communism is capitalism, and capitalism is about spending stuff. And so this idea that there became a really huge focus on clearly defined gender roles, which is where you're going to then get the ideal suburban housewife, and why so much art and imagery portrayed women in this way. And of course the nuclear family, just to give you an idea of like how, and then also political and social conformity, which is what pop art is. Let's say pop art goes against this, right, or challenges it. Right. So one of the things that pop art did is it ends up challenging that kind of social conformity, whereas the advertisements, consumerism, media all push the gender roles and social conformity. But to show you how crazy like this emphasis on gender roles was, there were house plans like by an architect that drew up house plans, and in the house plans, these rooms, right? And these are just rooms drawn that the architect drew. And these house plans clearly labeled like boys' room, girls' room, as if it mattered in some way. In the plans of a house, what room was the boys' room and which room was the girls' room. But that it's an apt reflection of that hyper focus on gender roles. So the ideal suburban housewife grew out of all of this, and in part was also connected to World War II and the war industry jobs. Women were let go as men returned from war, even though many wanted to continue working in those jobs. And because of the fear and anxiety that women in the war industry, which we saw with the artwork during World War II, had about the loss of femininity, there was a huge push to reinforce that traditional housewife. All right, sorry. It's inevitable. The dogs bark when I record. It's like they know because I'm not paying attention to them. But again, where I don't remember exactly where I was trying to get them to stop. But I noticed with the war industry and the fact that they wanted to keep working and they were pushed out, and then because of that fear of that loss of femininity, there was a huge push to use art, to use advertisements and the drawings and imagery in media to reinforce traditional housewife roles. And this was very much linked to that fear of loss of femininity that took place during World War II. And so the idea was this, when you couple it with the fear of communism and what they were trying to do with consumption and all of that, this all merges into this ideal suburban housewife as the perfect embodiment of reinforcing femininity, proper gender roles, and fighting against communism and all of those fears and anxieties, coupled with, of course, the post-war prosperity for at least white middle class families to be able to purchase things, to and so there's so much emphasis on consumption within the role of the ideal suburban housewife in that process. With that, and to give you an idea of like how it described the ideal housewife, Life magazine, there was a Life magazine article that highlighted the suburban housewife, and this article said that it was an American woman of 32 and a mother of four, a high school graduate who married her high school sweetheart. She was pretty and popular, a hostess and volunteer, and most importantly, a home manager. And they do focus on this idea of the home manager, right? That domestic ideology of that. But this right, this security and stability was seen in the reinforcement of this domestic role for women that reversed any of those gains that took place in World War II and restores that femininity And that focus was on the home, family, children, and house care. And even further than this is that you're going to get this idea of that women's identity should be around the domestic center. But even if you look at this drawing here, right, you have both the role that we're going to talk about and how women are supposed to be in a nice dress with an apron, but with makeup on, and high heels. And then you've got the consumer product, the fridge, those new electronics that showcase that prosperity, filled with a lot of food. She is happy and smiling. That's one of the things, is that women were supposed to be happy with this role, and not just with the role, but happy and dressed up while cleaning, happy and dressed up while cooking, right? That there was this very rigid ideal, and it got showed over and over and over again in advertisements and media, um, and to push this narrative of that. But the Gallup poll in 1961 asked, "What are your goals in life?" And these were the answers in order: 4 children, built-in oven, Formica countertops, finished woodwork, and a 4-bedroom house. Right? So in this poll, minus the children, all of it is domestic goods and products for the house. That's that identity component, right? The media pushed the idea that goods in the domestic sphere are what women want and will make them happy. So there were no personal goals. Like, besides maybe you could say the children, right? There were no personal goals. They didn't ask, what do you want in your house? What are your goals for your house? Every one of those answers, again, Formica built-in oven, Formica countertops, finished woodwork, 4-bedroom house. And I just excluded the children, which was the first one, right? So they didn't ask, what are your goals for your house? They asked, what are your goals? And it shows the effectiveness of this whole campaign and using visual imagery to reinforce it. So much so that women didn't give any personal goals whatsoever. Again, maybe outside of the children. It was all based around products, and specifically domestic products. That's how effectively this push and this kind of media campaign really did target people. Now, of course, we're going to see with pop art and other things, there was pushback, and not all women ended up, falling into this propaganda, if you will, but a lot did, and it shows you the power of that kind of persuasion and structure with that. So let's look at advertisements in the 1950s and the 1960s. I'll give a little bit of background, then we'll look at the PowerPoints that showcase a lot of those. The idea of domestic happiness through goods for women was reinforced by these advertisements, television, and media. In part because women were the largest consumers. They were the home manager. They were the ones that stayed at home and didn't work. They raised the children. And again, for this middle class, because yes, their lower classes, women had to work. Upper class, they were wealthy. They didn't need advertisements to convince them of anything. This was really targeting that middle white, the white middle class that were living in the suburbs, because this was a new group that had a larger spending power than before. And so it was very much targeted towards white women. The portrayal of the ideal suburban housewife was white women, largely leaving out any other women of color because of the specific aspect of who largely was moving into the suburbs because of those exclusions to other people. And because they were the ones that had the most kind of spending influence and power. That's where that connection is from that. But women were the largest consumers because they were, again, the ones staying at home in the middle class. They were the ones that then were going to the stores and buying the stuff for the house and the goods and whatnot. But it also, of course, we'll see reinforce very misogynistic roles and views of women that was so opposite of like the way that women were portrayed in the war industry during World War II. And it was very much this woman who was eager, well dressed, and hair and makeup. I mean, as we saw here, right? This perfect. It was always high heels. It was always with makeup, hair done perfectly, in a nice dress with an apron, looking happy and content. Um, well, the advertisements offered her, a specific product, while not so subtly instructing her on the proper domestic role she was meant to fulfill as a wife, a mother, or homemaker. Women were shown pining over cleaning equipment, food products, and clothing advertisements claimed, all this that would make their lives easier and how happy they would be using their products. It was there were several about like showing them women mopping and just looking ecstatic that they were mopping and how it's so much fun to mop. Right, that emphasis on like, this is great, this is fun, yay, we're so happy we're doing this kind of thing was certainly part of that. And then on the other end of that was threats of violence in advertisements and media that were just there as if it wasn't a big deal. Threats of husbands finding other women if they didn't fulfill the proper domestic role and serve their husbands, and general suggested violence towards women as something that was funny or entertaining rather than something that to be alarmed with. And again, we'll see TV and media did this as well. In one of the ads, it states that again, this hint that another woman could take their place, so you need to be careful. That if you're there's so many of the coffee ads were the worst at this, but one of them, the coffee ad basically says that if you and the commercials for the coffee too, like if you keep making bad coffee, your husband's gonna go find another woman who can make good coffee, right? And he'll leave you because you don't make good coffee. The other coffee advertisement suggested violence, saying if your husband ever finds out you're not store testing for fresher coffee, and then the woman is laid over his lap and he's like spanking her. But she has a smile on her face as if she's enjoying the intended violence. And in another ad for the advertisements, it's for sweaters, and the men are standing on the cliff while the woman's hanging off the side, and he's kind of just holding on to the rope while they barely notice. And it says, men are better than women. Indoors, women are useful, even pleasant. And okay, pleasant was the word of choice as the ideal wife was pleasant, which is almost a non like kind of characteristic. What is pleasant? Pleasant suggests you're just kind of this, generic, right? We don't want you to have too much personality because that can be cumbersome or bothersome in that sense. But it says, right, she's so women, men are better than women. Indoors, women are useful, even pleasant. On a mountain, they're something of a drag. So don't go hauling them up a cliff just to show off your sweater. Right? So this idea that like, and it looks like they're just leaving her like she's about to die in that process. And then another one, and I think these ones we'll look at in just a second. There was pants. It was for pants, and a woman's head is placed on an animal rug with a man stepping on her head like a trophy hunter, proclaiming it's nice to have a girl around the house. One even more obvious was an ad for a postage meter that said, "Is it always illegal to kill a woman?" Which was apparently because it looked like she'd messed up something with the postage. In all these cases, right, women are shown undisturbed by the suggestion of violence while still being properly dressed with makeup, visually reinforcing that submissive role. And I mean, you see it here too, right? Show her it's a man's world. And she's sitting here kneeling while giving him his food in bed, but like her arms raised up like she's worshiping him. And this goes to that women were supposed to be submissive and obedient to their husbands. And the advertisements like that reinforced it in that process. It was also reinforced in the magazine article on being a good housewife, right? You're supposed to have dinner ready when he comes home. It should be ready by the time he comes home. You need to take time to freshen up and look nice. Be interested in hearing about his day because he's had a busy day and works hard. Well, your job is not important. The article even says you may have a dozen important things to tell him, but the moment of his arrival is not the time. Let him talk first. Remember, his topics of conversation are more important than yours, right? This idea that whatever you about you, blah, it's not important. But the husband, your whole purpose should be to serve him, right? That they're secondary to that in that process. And then there was a Ready Whip advertisement that essentially suggested that, right, by serving desserts, you'll hold on to your husband. Um, and that's you gotta always be keeping your game up with that ideal proper housewife role, because at any minute the husband might be planning to leave you. Like, even this, my wash days are holidays now, so it's suggesting that, like, look, cleaning, it's a holiday. I have so much fun because it's so easy to do. I mean, sure, a washing machine made a huge difference in washing than when you use the washboard. Big difference. Nonetheless, still is household chores that they're trying to make suggest that women, and even here you can see again this other drawing, this woman again in that dress and the high heels, all done up. That was the uniform of the suburban housewife, and it was what was pushed over and over and over again in kind of all visual imagery of women during this time. Let's look at the other advertisements, and we saw this one, but this one, of course, is this idea of, like, oh, you mean a woman can open it, which of course is suggesting that women weren't capable of such things. And whoa, it's so exciting! Even a woman can open this one. There was a ton like this of, like, here's just showing again that ideal suburban housewife in drawings and stuff here with the again, it's the uniform. It's always the high heels, the apron, the nice dress. She's got her hair done. She has makeup on. She's smiling, right? All while doing all these chores. It's such a happy thing to do these chores. This one, I think, reinforces that too. Wives, look at this ad carefully. Circle the items you want for Christmas. Show it to your husband. If he does not go to the store immediately, cry a little. Not a lot, just a little. He'll go. Husbands, look over this ad carefully. Pick out what your wife wants. Go buy it before she starts to cry. So again, it's belittling women by the crying component, but also it's all you know kitchen goods that are suggesting that this is what they want. Or Christmas morning, she'll be happier with the Hoover. I'm like, she's got her hand on it. Oh, it's such a vacuum. It's such an amazing gift to get. And that's all part of that reinforcement of this. Right. So again, so the harder a wife works, the cuter she looks. This is for vitamins, for pep vitamins. But again, this idea of reinforcing women's role. Oh, you want your husband to be into you. Make sure you dress this way. Make sure you look this way. Make sure you're working hard. And then your husband will want to stick around. Here, married, and look at his face and how unhappy he is. No need to neglect your stockings. Husbands admire wives who keep their stockings perfect. Right? Wow, her husband is very disappointed in her because her stockings have runs in them. Right? She is not properly dressed in her uniform because her stockings have holes in them. Here, the chef does everything but cook. That's what wives are for. And that it's suggested, of course, that the mixer is going to do most of the work, but the wives will still cook. Again, that they have specific set roles. You don't challenge them. This one's, I'm late, but dinner won't be. This one's interesting because this one suggests that women are busy and they're doing other things. So sometimes, you can have the kind of TV dinner. That was a new thing, that you could ready-made meals put into the oven. There wasn't the microwave yet. So you have a little bit of that convenience in that. Here's the one we talked about, the violence for coffee. If your husband ever finds out you're not store testing, well, he's going to, spank you, beat you. a grown woman, right? It's a lot of these the imagery is of course the goal is to have women that they're not right, they're not equal to men, that they're there for men. Here's the one that says men are better than women. So see, she's like hanging on to the cliff while he's barely paying attention. They're just talking and chatting it up. She's about, facing death, right? This is the suggested violence, but also belittling too, because it says right there women are better than women. You don't even see her, but if anything, she's gonna fall off the cliff because they're not lifting her up. Here you have one that's advertising the pants, right? But again, it's this idea that you have her head, but then the rest of the body is like a hunting trophy from a carpet and stuff that way. So you have all these advertisements that again highlight this violence, highlight the joy of cleaning and working around the home, and that is reinforced over and over again by also then TV and wives being portrayed in the kind of the exact same way in that process. The most popular TV shows and the comedies had the families that followed these traditional gender roles where the husbands were the breadwinners and went to work while the wives stayed at home and took care of the home and helped raise the children, but ultimately deferred to the husband. June Cleaver is probably the best example of that pleasant that role in Leave It to Beaver. And you can, again, we talked about the imagery of like the clothing. They all are dressed in the same way because that was what was being pushed. But June Cleaver she had very little personality. She was there to reinforce and support the husband, to make jokes about how women were good in the kitchen when the kids asked why the dad was barbecuing, but their mom, and when their mom did the most of the cooking, he said, well, because the outdoors are for men, the indoors are for women. And then there was a joke in there where people laughed and stuff like that. The goal was to remain pleasant and agreeable, right? And while she did help raise the kids, she deferred to her husband when he got home, and she didn't have a lot of her like there weren't a lot of aspirations or goals or things she did outside of the home and the kids. She didn't feel like a main character. Now, I Love Lucy was different and yet the same. So I Love Lucy challenged a lot of the traditional portrayals initially, right? One, they lived in the city instead of the suburbs like almost all the other shows. She was in an interracial marriage. Spanish was spoken in the episode sometimes when Ricardo got angry. But she still, of course, wore the visual aspect of her was still that suburban housewife. But where Lucy differed, of course, is that she did challenge the expectations of what she was supposed to do. Her husband expected her to be the ideal suburban housewife, and she constantly tried to go against that and do what she wanted to do. And the comedy ensued when she pushed back and went and tried for whatever she wanted to do that kind of challenged that system. But the main comedy where it was the fact that it was always a horrific failure. And then in the end, she'd come back and accept her role, and that resolved and ended the episode. So, and even though Lucy challenged the initially challenged the system, the fact was that in the end, she because she failed at that, she accepted her role in what she was supposed to do. There also was aspects of violence. So when she made huge mistakes, spent too much money, did something silly, and Ricardo would get upset, he would I'm going to, and she'd back up looking like she was slightly afraid. He never did actually, do anything to her, but this idea of that suggested violence was also present. And then, she would sometimes challenge, like, wait, what am I doing? And then, like, talk back to him. But so I Love Lucy was different in the sense that it pushed those boundaries, but still always actually ultimately reinforced the same thing as all of these others with the traditional gender roles, the nuclear family, and conformity in that process. And then you have that constant visual representation within the shows of how they were dressed, along with what the jobs and roles that they were doing in there. There was another episode of I Love Lucy that's really good for this. So you watch, it's like job switching. I don't know if that's exactly what it's called, but they basically say to each other, her and Ethel, like, oh, we can, the men saying your job isn't hard, and they're like, yes, it is. We do all these things, and they're like, we could do your job. No, we could do your jobs. They agree to swap places, and then of course both sides. The whole point of this is that was a huge thing. That is a big thing during this time, to go against script and have the men doing the housework and the women going to work. But of course, how it reconciles and falls back in line is the men were horrible at the housework, and they cook too much rice, the chicken in the pressure cooker explodes, everything goes wrong. For the women, they get fired in a couple places, finally end up in a chocolate factory where everything goes wrong. In the end, they come back and both realize how horribly wrong it went. And they do recognize that each other actually does a lot of work, but that they cannot do each other's roles. And can we switch back after just one day, even though they were supposed to do it for a week? And then they go, yeah, all happy, right? The natural order and balance has been restored. The comedy ensued because when they tried to challenge those traditional norms, things went wrong. Once they accept their set roles, then everything is right in the world. And again, I think the point of this is just that this is what was pushed so much for women. Now, and how women were portrayed, and all of the visual imagery that was thrown at women on how they were supposed to live and be. Now, pop art challenged a lot of the traditional norms of art. And also, women are going to kind of challenge that because, there was a bit of resistance. As much as pop art was seen as this kind of radical anti-art it wasn't establishment, I suppose, but anti-art movement. They definitely, women were once again largely excluded from this movement and ignored, and had to push their way to be seen in that process. And so pop art was often done by men. The big names of pop art in the 50s and 60s were men. Women were often portrayed in art through the eyes of men in pop art. But again, pop art challenged the traditional expectations in the 1950s. That one of the big things they did is they erased boundaries between high and low culture and fine art and mass production. So there had been this standard and system, and we actually saw, and I have it here, the Dada movement, that there actually was some challenge to that with the Dada movement before this. But that there very much was this sense in the art world that there was fine art, painting, sculpture, drawing, and this kind of standard of what types of themes and topics would be covered in that. And that advertising wasn't art, that soups of can were not art, products were not, comic books were not art, advertisements were not art, and that yes, so you have fine art if you're drawing or painting. The subjects had to be in these worthy categories, and so pop art, of course, challenged that whole idea and system, and looked to some of it was very much a challenge to the commodity-based system of the 1950s. The changes that the post-World War era had created, this commodity-driven value that had shaped advertisements and the ideal suburban housewife imagery. So it often had commonplace objects such as soup cans. This one is soda, Coca-Cola bottles, and things like that. And comic strips, road signs, television, and images from televisions and movies, advertisements, and many other seemingly random, mass-produced objects became the subject matter or part of the work. Um, and it was meant to again connect that mass production that could be thrown on its head for that. And so some of it is a critique on the this consumption and mass production of society that had taken place in the 50s. Others just wanted to say, like, have this be that art didn't need to be so finely restricted into what was considered high art and what was not. um, and so that's kind of that sense with pop art is challenging uh, the societal expectations, and looking at um, you know critiquing society as well. The other thing is that pop art became popular because it often used a lot of bright colors, which of course grabs attention and was so different from you know, real life photorealism, or just even, painting a mountain scene or whatever. Along with that, it was easy to mass produce. So they're somewhat challenging the system by using mass production of things to make art. But then that popularity emerged because it was easy to mass produce in of itself as well. Pop art was often, like, there was pushback. It was described as vulgar, sensational, non-aesthetic, a joke, right? And whereas its supporters saw it as art that was democratic and non-discriminatory, which is ironic because they very much were um, they really discriminated against women quite a bit. But the idea that it could bring together both connoisseurs of art and untrained viewers. And in that sense, they're right. Pop art brought in a lot of people who didn't traditionally like art and liked this art and wanted to experience this art. So it did reach out to people that wouldn't have seen themselves as traditionally art lovers or whatever in that sense of the case. So that's that. Women had a hard time getting into pop art to being recognized and stuff. But let's look first at male artists' portrayal of women and themes from the male pop artists. One of the things you can see, here's two of them already. So here's one, here's another. A male pop artist loved Marilyn Monroe. Some of the pop art stuff in terms of beauty and female form was connected to Playboy magazine and the idea of the new pinup model. And Marilyn Monroe kind of embodied female sexuality. So male pop artists saw this as them challenging the traditional system of the ideal suburban housewife, right? We're sexualizing women. We're showing pinups and how women can be sexual. And sure, but it again was men sexualizing women in art rather than women taking control of that narrative. And so it still ends up objectifying them rather than being some kind of liberal revolution against the ideal suburban housewife and the merits of believing it was wrong, right? It wasn't. They weren't doing it for some sense of, oh, the ideal suburban housewife is a toxic image of women that is unrealistic and makes women unhappy, which it did. There was a whole era, and most of the women that were the suburban housewives were college educated, and they got their college degree, and then they got married, and they never did anything with it. And there were a lot of deeply unhappy women that were constantly being told they should be happy because they have all this stuff, because they have the home, and that they should be happy being a housewife, and they weren't. And the fear and anxiety of trying to figure out what's wrong with me, because I'm being told over and over again I should be happy, I should be content, and yet I am depressed and so just feel like there's something missing. And it's because they weren't being challenged. There wasn't any room for women to express their own personality or have their own goals right outside of domestic consumption. And so, right, men weren't male pop artists weren't challenging that with these sexualized images and stuff like that. No, they were just enjoying that they could shock people with the view of women and showing these different art pieces that were not the proper gender roles that women were supposed to be portraying, that the general society and media had been pushing. So I think that's important to notice, that it definitely wasn't, yes, these images of Marilyn Monroe and the idea of the pinup girl and the sexualized sense of women was a challenge and a push against the conservative suburban housewife. But it wasn't some kind of like, we're supporting women being free to make their choices. Not only that, of course, but that there was often misogynistic undertones to what they were doing. Also male artists, they tend to have more emphasis on cartoony and exaggerated styles. They focused on consumerism, celebrities, largely Marilyn Monroe, and women's sexuality. Also, random objects and items that didn't have a deeper meaning, right? The cola, the soda bottles, the Campbell's soup. Some of it wasn't meant to be deep. There wasn't layers of meaning behind it. It was supposed to be fun and quirky. That was definitely part of that charm with that. Now, with women and female artists and portrayal of women, you have some of that, because certainly women did follow in that similar fashion, but you also have some differences that definitely take place. They definitely, their artwork a lot more than men's artwork, tried to subvert misogynistic imagery in magazines and popular culture. They challenged the normalization of violence in advertisements and television. Rosalind Drexler did this a ton. We're going to talk about her in just a minute, but this is actually one of her art pieces too. She had several that showcase this sense of violence and relationships and having it be a critique, right? So women, the female artists in the pop art tended to have more underlying meaning behind their artwork, whereas men, that wasn't always the case. They also challenged the view of women as wholesome housewives. So you have that too. Address female empowerment and societal expectations, stereotypes of women in popular culture. They also examine the realities of domestic life and consumer culture. I mean, the consumer culture one was very much, the challenging the consumer culture was across the board. That was actually the same for men and women. So that one, and that makes sense because that was super pushed in society. So, and pop art just seemed to, tie directly to that. And so again, the idea that their artwork kind of expanded to address deeper issues, which deviated from the initial development of the genre, which was more lighthearted and superficial. But did sometimes get into critique. Women's artwork more often in pop art than not did have that underlying component, where men's there were some and then lots that didn't. So let's look first at Rosalind Drexler. She was born in 1926 and began making sculptures in the 1950s before moving to painting and pop art. She actually was also a wrestling star and an artist. She was an artist, but an actor, an actress as well. So she did a ton of things with that. So she used scenes from movie posters, magazines, and newspapers, and enlarged copies. She enlarged copies of those materials and then painted over them in vibrant colors, right? So you can see her background. So this one is clearly hers too. She did a lot of these bright, solid color backgrounds, right? That were meant to pop and catch your eye, but at the same time, also because nothing else going on in the background, right? It's just the color that ends up focusing your attention on the people. If there's a ton going on in the background, then you're competing between those two things for what you're going to pay attention to. So the bright color pops and draws you in, and then because it's just the solid color, it draws your focus straight to the character and puts all of the emphasis on that. And very much a style of hers that she did with that. Almost, if you see that style, it's often hers. With that. Also super impressive is that, and she, her self-portrait, which is this one is her self-portrait, although doesn't look like her exactly. We don't know who like the model actually was, but by proclaiming it as a self-portrait, it certainly has it connected to her own like ideas of sexuality, as well as challenging the objectification of women's bodies, which we'll talk about in this in just a minute a little bit more. So it's like this interesting of, they don't think it was actually her, but it allowed it to say it was her, allowed her to connect her to the being a woman in this world with this objectification in that way. But she was, with this one, she was invited to the first international, even the title of this, the first international girly exhibit, which was all about celebrating pop's art portrayal of the pinup as the American symbol. And there were only 2 women pop artists that got invited to this. And we're going to look at both of them and stuff. So again, the event is called First International Girly Exhibit. Only 2 women artists were actually exhibited. Their artwork was displayed. And then, of course, the idea that the pinup as the American symbol of like women, or just in general American symbol as it was. Again, pinup girls were common features of work of male pop artists during this time. And later in the 60s, there was an increase leading up to the civil rights and feminist movement, with women and sexuality being more free. And so pop artists continued to take advantage and utilize that in their artwork. So Drexler's self-portrait here kind of subverts the misogyny portrayed in the magazines and pinups and stuff, with like the positioning of the self-portrait or the pinup, right? She's in this weird, awkward pose that was not a pose of the pinup, but it's almost making fun of their kind of weird poses that they did have. The facial expression is kind of this awkward, weird look, and then her skin is blue, right? So all those like traditional aspects of beauty are subverted here, and makes it look like this anxiety and kind of trap from that, and how she's portrayed. So within the self-portrait, right, it definitely is trying to subvert the misogyny of the pinup girl in general, as well as challenging objectification by making it this awkward, not as appealing look with the blue skin, with her facial expression, with just even the pose in and of itself. But still, clearly being connected to the pinup girl with the weird pose and the stockings and the garter and the clothing and all of that. The other thing that she did is a lot of her works conveyed the imbalance of power relationships and violence, as I mentioned, between them, or the threat of violence associated with that. In this one here, which is Put It This Way, right? You have it showing, male violence towards women, capturing the moment right after the slap to a woman's face as she falls to the ground. Again, it's that bright background color, which then focuses everything on what's taking place with that violence, so it stands out. Your focus has to be to that one. And here another one, I won't hurt you. The same thing of the suggesting that, that there's a looming violence as a man's covering the woman's mouth and holding her, but proclaiming that he's not going to hurt her. There was another one that was the opposite of that, which was self-defense, and it depicts a moment of strength where a woman actually is holding a gun as she pins down her attacker and is clawing her face with his nails. So she didn't just show violence to women; she did actually show women fighting back as well. And that's this one here. I don't have a picture of that, and I should have added that one too, but you can look it up, and stuff. So you have these ones here with the violence, the man putting his hand around her throat, some fighting that's going on underneath, and then these ones here. But you also have she had several where it showed women as strong, as fighting back, as getting the upper hand in that process. She also had one with Marilyn Monroe, Marilyn Pursued by Death. Again, Marilyn was used in a ton by the male pop artists, and so she took it from a different perspective. Super, plain background that's actually darker. The characters are actually, so it's a dark background. The characters are outlined in red, which gives a sense of danger. And it's Marilyn, and she's being followed by the paparazzi. And they overlap, so it looks like he's gaining on her while she's trying to flee, which created this sense of that she was trying to escape danger. And of course, it also was a criticism of celebrity culture with the constant women here, Marilyn constantly being followed. So it almost gave like an alternate, more empathetic view of Marilyn Monroe and what she had to go through and how she was objectified, and that her, she was in this kind of sense of danger and being chased and followed constantly in that process. The next artist is Marjorie Strider. She was the other woman artist that was exhibited at the first International Girly exhibit. And she enjoyed challenging conventions and defying viewers' expectations, especially with what she was most known for is the super innovative aspect of integrating, mixing painting with parts that were sculpted. So you have the face here. This is with a girl with a radish, but the eyelashes and the radish and part of the mouth are actually like sculpted and built out of the painting. So you had both like the three-dimensional components with the painting. And it created this she did it with, she had the canvas for the painting, and she started with wood, and then she eventually used foam components that she carved and stuff into it. So this was definitely her kind of characteristic of her artwork, was known for this. And it allowed for a lot of times the kind of portrayal of women have viewers questioning which is more real, the flat stereotype of which she often showed, because of course here you have women that a lot of her characters were shown in kind of that traditional pop art sexualized way, but then you're questioning whether that was the real portrayal or was the extension and the 3D component part of that as well. Right, you have this one here, Come On, which shows, so this one is a girl with a radish. Come On is this one here, which shows this flirtatious woman, and of course the emphasis of what was built out with the breast. But at the same time, it's showing women being, flirting and having some sexuality components to it, but not being the excessive, posed pinup girl style. So it challenges the pinup girl fantasy while also dispelling it, but empowering that sense of femininity and sexuality that women can still have. Right. And that definitely was that aspect. And she liked to satirize that portrayal of women in the Playboy magazines a lot of the time. She actually was able to secure a solo expedition after the first International Girly Expedition, um, and which was advertised as girls, flowers, and vegetables. And she had a lot of still life stuff too, that tested those boundaries between mediums. She liked to play with mixed mediums a lot, blending them into each other. So that even her paintings kind of refused to conform to mediums traditions, and this made her very unique in the pop art world, because most pop art, actually I don't know, the pop art didn't usually do this with any kind of other three-dimensional component. They challenged a lot of traditions and artistic expectations, but she took it to a different level and did it in a way that no one else was doing at the time. And so it certainly helped gain a lot of her, not I guess not notoriety. That's like the bad sense of it, but it helped her gain a following, and it helped her be able to get her solo expedition because she had that unique kind of component to it that others in any of the male pop artists were not doing, and made it very unique and stand out, and people really kind of gravitated towards that. And then we have Idelle Weber. She is best known for her silhouette paintings, which are these. And what's crazy is this this looks like an Apple ad. I feel like, not anymore, but like the early Apple ads. If you go back and look at like when Apple started becoming popular with the iPod, this is what they did. They did all that silhouette stuff, and they had to have been inspired. It'd be really interesting to know, where they came up with the idea, but they had to have been inspired by pop art and potentially Idelle Weber, because like this isn't the only one. I only put one in here like this. Here's some other silhouettes, obviously, but the bright, vibrant colors, them, moving, dancing around and motion and stuff. That's so, you look at this, and if you're familiar with like Apple's early iPod advertisements, like I don't know anyone who, if they knew that, wouldn't look at this and see that connection. So it'd be really interesting. I don't know, any of their origin of where they came up from it, but certainly it appears that they had influence from not only pop art in those early advertisements, but also potentially from Idelle Weber as well. Because she had several like these here that all kind of scream Apple ads, but obviously hers came first in that. So she's best known for silhouettes, but she does branch out and do other things in the process, although she kind of moves away from pop art. So she's one of the very few artists, male or female pop artists, that actually moved to photorealism and still art. So she kind of went in a different direction. If pop artists were anything but pop artists, they usually started in traditional painting and style first and then moved into pop art. She's one of the few that started more in pop art, although she did do some other stuff early on, but she kind of went away from pop art, where most pop artists didn't transition away from that once they switched to it. She grew up in Los Angeles, and then after she got married, she moved to New York and tried to begin exhibiting her work. And she had some very clear examples of sexism in the art world, and kind of being rejected and pushed away from that. Quite a bit. Numerous galleries talked about how they admired her work, but straight up said that they did not show women artists. Art historian Horst Jansen praised her to her specifically privately, but straight up said he excluded women artists from his books. So as an art historian, he just said, "Yeah, I'm not going to put women in my art history books." And then she asked Robert Motherwell, who was an art instructor, if she could audit his classes at Hunter College, and he refused, saying, "What's the point? Married women with children do not continue to paint." So she had to, and she's not the only one, right? But we have some very clear, stories about how she had to keep pushing against this constant rejection, this constant push to say why women don't, women shouldn't be recognized. No, we're not gonna, your work's awesome, but we don't include women in any of our galleries and exhibits, just for no other reason than to say no women, because women, essentially saying women aren't in the same class as men when it comes to art. And then to straight up be told, well, why bother auditing my class? It's not like married women continue painting, which was very much part of that ideal suburban housewife that once you got married and had kids, you weren't supposed to work. You were supposed to stay home and take care of the kids. So that was very much in line with the time frame of what was being pushed as what women were supposed to do with their life. Despite these challenges, she persevered, and she continued to do art and began to really develop the hard-edged silhouettes that became her defining style of art. All of the silhouettes were like anonymous figures engaged often in everyday activities, or I suppose acrobatics. Right here you have men on an elevator that look like slightly business suits, just riding the elevator going to work. You do have ones that they're kind of in acrobatic positions and stuff like that. This one here, you have, and this, what's funny with this one, I didn't mention, this one is, this is called like Munchkins 1, 2, and 3. So yeah, it's business and riding on escalators, but the title, because it's 3 separate canvases, she actually had to have each canvas, because they were so big, in a different room in her small apartment, and then took them out to be put together to be displayed, because she couldn't paint them all connected, because her apartment was not big enough to do so. So again, Munchkins 1, 2, and 3, based on the number of them there. But she also then moved into looking at other mediums besides canvas and painting with the silhouettes. So she actually did, you have the jump rope lady, which was actually done originally with the painting, but then she ended up doing the 3-dimensional sculpture, and you can see the light with the jump rope. And then here you have, this one is untitled, but it's these like I don't know, acrylic cubes with the silhouettes in them. So she had initially the paintings, and then expanded into other sculpture 3-dimensional ones, and these became very popular as well. Maybe even slightly more so than just the paintings, but all of her silhouette stuff was very, very popular. And then she ends up switching from the pop art style to photorealistic techniques, where what she'd do, she'd go out into the city with a Polaroid, she'd take pictures around New York of trash, of a fruit stand, of other random mundane things in the streets of New York, and then she painted them in super realistic, photorealistic style. So again, it was a very sharp contrast and transitional way, but certainly just an evolution of her style and what she was interested in, what she wanted to do. Certainly, you could argue, she always stayed true to herself on what she, her style and inspiration that she wanted to focus on, and didn't worry about whether it fit into a specific genre in that process. So that's looking at that. I like the contrast of this. That's why I wanted to kind of combine the two, is that you have on one hand the imagery and artwork and style of mass marketing, mass culture, which was very much the 50s of mass consumption, with advertising and media and TV that pushed on women this idea of the ideal suburban housewife. And it was reinforced in so much imagery over and over and over again. And not just that in imagery, but also in the written word, right? In magazines, in books, in studies. They had Dr. Spock, psychologist, that was pushing this as well. So even in the written form, right? You had literary, you had visual form. And then in products too, right? And that's partly with that connection with the advertising. Women were being, presented this particular image of the ideal suburban housewife that was almost, meant to not have their own individual identity, but be this kind of cohesive collective whole that was supposed to combat, communism and the anxiety and fear of the nuclear threat through proper gender role and behavior, and that created that visual imagery of that ideal suburban housewife, which was connected to submission to husband, violence, and happiness and contentment through fulfillment through, domestic products. And then on the opposite end of that, you have pop art, which challenged all of that and said, yeah, whatever, screw that traditional style. We're going to be looking at random stuff such as Campbell's soup and soda cans and comic books, and we're going to blow up, and take art from comic books, from magazines, from advertisements themselves, and we're going to change it. We're going to use super bright colors and be bold. And then you have women artists come in and say, we're going to challenge the traditional role of women and that suburban housewife style, objectification of women, because again, as much as the pop art was challenging that, they were doing it in a way that was just objectifying women in many ways, with the pinup girl and that type of thing, and that Marilyn Monroe style. And so a female pop artist, essentially, we're then taking that a step further and saying, yeah, we're going to challenge these traditional structures of society, and we're also going to challenge this view and objectification of women that the male pop artists are putting in. We're going to question the violence that's being shown in society towards women. We're going to have women fighting back against that. We're going to be creative and do completely different things that were unique and hadn't been done before to challenge that system. And so it's the 50s are kind of, both World War II and the 50s were this dichotomy of very kind of push and pull views of women, right? In World War II, it was, work in the war industry, and this is important and altruistic, but also don't be too masculine, right? It's too scary if we want you to do this, but also, it's making you masculine, so be feminine, and also then don't work, right? And that back and forth. And then after the war in the 50s and early 60s, it was, okay, yeah, we told you to work and you were strong and you can do it, but now you need to go back to being super feminine and having your whole identity around being the household and your husband and children. But also, like, we want you to be college educated and think and do all that, right? And that kind of produced this sense of pushing back against that with pop art. So it's, again, suburban housewife, advertising media, pop art, right? And that's the dichotomy there. And it really was both of those periods. There's this massive dichotomy on how women were viewed, how they were portrayed, in art and in visual representations, and what they were being told and what was being like pushed at them all the time. It had to be confusing to constantly get these mixed messages all the time about what you were supposed to do. And so when women were able to step outside of that and push up against that, it was a big deal, because you were certainly being bombarded by this other message all the time. And pop artists kind of said, nah, forget that. We're going to do our own thing. All right, so that's it for this week.